Hello and welcome to the presentation where we will talk about the Log4j vulnerability exploitation flow, mitigation, and the recommendations that we need to follow. As you might be aware, this exploit was released in the public domain on 10th of December, and since then we have started seeing active recons and attackers have started exploiting this vulnerability. Vulnerability resides in the Java library log4j, which the parent of this library is Apache. They have released the patch, but the different vendors, different products where this library is getting used, they have released patches or some of them are yet to release the patches. So this makes this vulnerability deadly as it is getting used in variety of products and frameworks, right from your firewall to your CCTV cameras. All are vulnerable to this attack if they are using this particular library. So let's see how the flow looks like. Exploit flow. To start this exploit, attacker should have a web interface. So if you are running a web facing application which runs on HTTP, HTTPS or TCP or any TCP protocol, attacker can then send a string to the web server. So first stage of this attack involves attacker to send a specially crafted web request. So this will be a simple GET request to your web application where attacker will add its payload that can trigger this vulnerability. As you can see on my screen, the request containing dollar curly bracket JNDI colon LDAP. So this is one of the common string that we have identified so far that attackers are using to trigger this vulnerability in the server. So once this request is made to the server, and if your server is relying on the Java library, the vulnerability will trigger, and this will make server to send a request to the attacker controlled infrastructure. Again, server will come to know about what is the IP of that attacker is or the domain is, and that is again through the web request that attacker is making in the first stage. So attacker, once he sends this request, server will send a new request to the attacker controlled infrastructure that will be initiated through a Java naming and directory interface. So this is again the JNDI component of web application which will initiate this request. Once server makes request to the attacker, attacker can then send a new response, or it will respond to the request which is coming from the server. The response will contain a Java class file. So this Java class file is nothing but again a code which will be injected into the application process which is running on the server. For example, if you are running an IIS server, IIS will have a W3WP process which will be running on the OS, and the Java class file will be injected into this process. Attacker can then control the source code of your application. Once this file is injected into the process, attacker will get access to perform remote code execution on your server. So this will allow to initiate the second stage of the attack. And the second stage of attack is attacker can conduct RCE, remote code execution on your server. While third and fourth stages of the attack are the typical scenarios that we have seen even in case of the earlier critical vulnerability that have been released. For example, the exchange ones where attackers or the threat actor groups, they are using the critical vulnerability for initial access, and then they act on their objectives either by deploying ransomware or by deploying the miners. So in here as well, we are expecting this critical vulnerability to be exploited for the initial access, and then threat actor groups will leverage this vulnerability to deploy ransomwares, and some we are also expecting some APT groups to take advantage of this vulnerability, as the vulnerability is quite easy to exploit, and once it is exploited, attackers will get access to your environment. So let's see what are the mitigations for this vulnerability. To mitigate this vulnerability permanently, you have to update your log4j version. And if your Java version is greater than 8U121 or greater than 2.10, there are different mitigation steps that we recommend here. So in the first case, this is again the temporary mitigations that we would recommend. The permanent should be by updating the log4j version. For the temporary workaround, you can set a couple of objects or features in your web application to false. As you can see in the first example, for com.sun.jndi.rmi.object, if we set it to false, attacker will not be able to use the JNDI component remotely. And the second thing is again for the same JNDI component, where attacker will simply lose access to the JNDI from the remote environment, and that will he will if even if he makes the request, server will not be able to respond it due to the restrictions that we have in place. So the web request will become invalid and there will be no response sent to the attacker. And the other scenario that we have seen, if there are earlier versions of Log4j from 2.10, then we have to set uh, three parameters here, where first two parameters can be set to true, where we are asking web application not to look up those. So those fields have been called in here, and we are setting them to true, and also we are setting the JVM parameter. So again, if we set this features to true, the web request will simply become invalid. And even in third scenario, we are asking web application to remove the JNDI lookup class from the class path. So JNDI component will simply not look up for any such Java class file if it is getting injected or posted to the web application. Second mitigation step is quite creative, or you can say out of the box idea, where your web application support team or the design team, they need to blacklist any web requests coming from the attacker's IP, or simply look after the web request which contains the string as shown on my screen here, dollar curly bracket JNDI colon or base 64. So base 64 again, point to be noted here is it could be an indicator of a vulnerability exploit, but what that vulnerability being exploited is, it will simply depend upon the web request. So this is again our recommendation, that you apply this mitigation on the web application, where you can blacklist any request or user agent which contains these two strings in it. Either of these strings can be monitored, and if you see this in your web request or the user agent, then you can blacklist those, that particular source, or simply do not process that request any further on the server. So you can have this amended in your web application source code. Third one is restricting LDAP access via JNDI. So if you are following the above couple of mitigations that we have mentioned for the Java versions, you are already doing partial mitigations of it. But the third one will simply restrict LDAP access from the JNDI component. So with the JNDI component, attacker will not be able to access the LDAP functionality of the server. So again, this is a partial mitigation. If we are tying this up with the first recommendation, we are completely mitigating this vulnerability. So let's take a look at the recommendations and the scenarios. So if you are in a scenario where your web server has responded successfully, then you should focus on the containment first by isolating web server from the local environment, as well as disconnecting it from the internet. You have to block the IOCs on the firewall. So indicator of compromise in the form of IP addresses are available, and those can be used to block those on your perimeter firewall. Again, you have to contact the vendor to patch this vulnerability or apply mitigations that we discussed in the earlier slide. And also, you should activate incident response playbook. You should consider this server to be compromised, and you should investigate it thoroughly to identify any signs of executions, persistence mechanism if attacker has established any. And then it also involves that your perimeter firewall should be updated. It should be the IDS IPS module of the firewall should be enabled, and the signatures to be updated, and they should be put into the prevent mode, so that the requests which are coming from the internet are not reaching your web server. Second scenario is where your firewall is allowing the connection, but web server is responding with an error code. So web server responding with an error code, that means your web application is possibly not vulnerable to the exploit. It is not running that vulnerable version on the web application. In this scenario as well, we would recommend to take this on priority and block these IOCs on the firewall, and also check for any other internet facing application that you are having and running this vulnerable version. In that case, also you have to contact the vendor to patch this vulnerability or apply mitigations if patch is not available or update is not available from the vendor yet. Third scenario is where firewall again is allowing this connection. So you should enable IDS IPS signature on the firewall. The module should be enabled, signature to be deployed into the prevent mode. That will ensure firewall uh, is blocking all these requests, and it is not allowing this request to be going towards the web server. Fourth point includes all your web-facing applications to be monitored regularly so that they can look after the signs of this compromise or the attacks in the logs. Third case is where your firewall is actually preventing all these requests. But remember, there was a window when exploit was released and the time when firewall vendor has released the signature. Between this window, we expect there was, or we should expect, there were recon exploit requests which are coming from the attacker. In that case, we recommend to check your web application logs to identify any 200 response code that your web server has given towards the attacker. So in this case, we recommend that you should look after the logs, check for any successful response to those requests, and you can use those strings that we have seen in the exploit flow for the $JNDI or base 64 if they are seen in your web logs. If you see those and your web server has responded with a 200 code, in that case as well, you should activate your incident response. Additionally, if those were only error codes, you are uh, more likely you have only seen the first stage of the attack and not the second stage of the attacks. In that case, we are in good shape. But again, you should also audit your environment to see if you are running any application which is vulnerable to this exploit. At some point of time, all of your internet facing application will be targeted to check if they are vulnerable to this exploit. Fourth point again involves all of your web facing applications to be onboarded with your SOC and they are getting monitored regularly. So thank you and make sure you are protected against this vulnerability.